Welcome to the Exam Room Podcast, brought to you by the Physicians Committee. Hi, I'm the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll. Thanks so very much for watching and downloading in more than 150 countries around the world and making the Exam Room one of the most consumed nutrition podcasts anywhere on the planet today. And on the planet this day, we are in Rochester, Minnesota at the Health and Happiness Symposium put on by the Lotus Health Foundation. And I'm joined by our friend and amazing dietitian from Canada, the one, the only Brenda Davis. Thanks for being here again.
I'm so excited to be here, Chuck. Thank you so much for having me.
It is truly an honor anytime you are on the show. And usually when we're on, we talk about protein. You are the queen of protein. And you gave a phenomenal presentation on it. But I don't want to talk to you too much just about protein today. There was a specific part of your presentation here that really stood out to me where you were talking about your time in the Marshall Islands. You just returned from the Marshall Islands, did you not?
Yes, just a few weeks ago. April 23rd, we came back, and I was there this time only for 10 days. And normally when I go for at least a month or more. But it was a little bit of a quick trip with my son. And it was really quite wonderful because I hadn't been since 2017. With COVID, and it was really tough to get into the country. So this is the first time back, and it was really interesting in so many ways.
I don't think a lot of people are too familiar with the Marshall Islands. When we look at where they are from a health perspective, how does the Marshall Islands compare with, say, the United States?
Well, first of all, I should say the Marshall Islands, for those people that aren't familiar with them, they're sort of halfway between Hawaii and Australia. If you're looking at a map, it's like 3,500 miles directly north of New Zealand, just above the equator. And there's literally nothing within a couple of thousand miles in any direction. So they're so remote that they were actually chosen to be the atomic bomb testing grounds after the Second World War. And that, as you can imagine, caused a lot of misery there.
I would imagine so. That's a piece of history I was not familiar with. That does not sound very pleasant, unfortunately. In terms of their health status, I mean, we know that the rates of obesity and chronic illness here in the United States are really, really, really high. What are they like in the Marshall Islands?
Oh, probably a little worse than they are in the United States. And in fact, the longevity it's really sad to look at. I think it's about 65 years for men and about 69 for women. And the rates of diabetes, heart disease are through the roof. And in fact, about half of all surgeries on the islands are amputations due to diabetes.
So, hold on, like 65 and 69 years old. I don't even look at that as old. I don't even like to say years old. Like to me, 65 and 69, that's still years young. You don't really get to drop the big O word until you're north of maybe 80, 85.
Exactly.
That seems like an awful lot of life is being cut short.
Oh, and I'm 65 myself. And so I think that would be it. I would be in my last few years. And it's really sad, and it really is a product of the diseases, the lifestyle-induced diseases that have become pandemic globally, but even more so in the Marshall Islands.
So we're talking about heart disease and diabetes, two conditions that we know are very much lifestyle-driven. How much of the typical lifestyle there is the big driving factor for them in these cases?
Well, what's really interesting is 100 years ago, these diseases were unheard of in the Marshall Islands, or pretty much unheard of. They were living off the land, and when people live off the land, they tend not to get obese. They tend not to get chronic diseases such as diabetes, type 2 diabetes, or cardiovascular disease. And they literally went from living off whatever they could catch in the ocean, fish and seafood, and then whatever they could collect from the land, which was mainly coconut, pandanus, bananas, maybe some taro, and whatever green leaves were edible. That was their diet for generations. And the main island, Majuro, which is an island that it's 3.7 square miles in area and about 30 miles long. So some people have beachfront property out their back door and their front door. It's literally, you can throw a ball across in some spots. And it's a coral atoll. So there's not a lot of arable soil. At one end of the island, there's some, but generally it's not a place where you think of tropical islands and all the lush mangoes and papayas and all of those things, not there. So it's very limited in terms of what they can grow in the volume. And so that island might be able to support, 500 or 600 people. Well, there are 30,000 people there. And so they have to import food. They can't be self-sustaining with that number of people. And because the population is quite poor, there's not a lot of employment opportunities. They import the cheapest, often non-perishable, because they're so far from anything, non-perishable foods that are, of course, ultra-processed and very, very addictive. And you know all about that.
That seems like a really difficult situation, because then I would imagine if you're trying to import perishable items, you have to expedite the shipping because they are so isolated.
Yep.
I would imagine even still, you're not going to get the highest quality fresh produce there. And if it's a economically struggling country and you've got that markup on fresh produce, that's going to make it unattainable for the vast majority of residents.
Oh, you've hit the nail on the head, Chuck. And in fact, when we were there before and I went into the biggest grocery stores, I was really disappointed in what was available. And the quality they were selling things that were going bad, literally. And the prices on those things were really high. This time, I was in shock when I looked at the produce. A head of romaine lettuce was $10. An avocado was $7.99. A mango was $7.99.
For what?
For one. And the mangoes that were $7.99 were a very funny color. It looked like if you opened them up, they would have been black inside. They were garbage. They were literally garbage. Some of the produce looked fairly nice, like the romaine lettuce, and there were some carrots, and apples and oranges are usually okay. But when you're earning $3 an hour or $3.50 an hour, there's just no way. You can't buy a head of romaine lettuce, especially when you've got 12 people living in the house and there's 1 or 2 people working. And so it is very, very difficult. So when we were there originally, one of our key... So first of all, I should tell you what brought me to the Marshall Islands originally is I was part of a team that did a randomized controlled clinical trial there. And the trial, essentially, we had 5 overlapping cohorts of people who were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and they were randomized into receiving usual care or receiving a fairly aggressive or intensive lifestyle medicine program. In our program, we had people we started at 2 weeks, increased for a month, where we would do intensive. They got 3 meals a day from the clinic. It was whole food, plant-based. It was exercise every day, walking. They would be with us for about 8 hours a day, getting instruction in every pillar of lifestyle medicine. And then after the month was finished, then they would be with us twice a week. So at first it was 4 times a week, and we would package their foods for the weekend. So the only foods they were supposed to eat was foods that were coming from the clinic. And then slowly they started to prepare their own food, and we would just have them a couple of times a week. And we did that for a period of 3 months. So pretty intensive lifestyle medicine for 3 months. And the results are being published this year.
Oh,
so,
we've got.
So
okay.
yeah, so we have the description of the intervention in a 2019 study, And now this year we're expecting, well, we've submitted the paper, and it looks like it's going to be accepted. So we're quite excited about that, and it will be published fairly shortly. So,
are you able to tell us what journal it might be in?
It looks like Diabetologia,
Nice.
which is one of the
That's a big
pretty big diabetes journals, and we did see an average drop in A1C of about 2 points in this group. So it was very encouraging. We had quite a few people achieve remission. So yeah, it works. And one of the interesting things is when we arrived in these islands, people really believed that diabetes was just the luck of the draw, and they didn't believe it had anything to do with lifestyle choices. They thought it might be, the product of radiation from years ago that was still lingering and affecting their health, or just an act of God, or whatever. It was not on their radar, and they didn't believe that lifestyle changes would have an impact, and they were shocked. And to be honest, I was shocked at how fast the changes happen. So you put someone who's eating, and I'll explain to you what they are eating nowadays in a second, but you put them on a whole food plant-based diet and get them walking after meals and doing exercise every day, and within a week, it was unbelievable. We would see drops in blood sugar. Well, the average in 2 weeks was 75 milligrams per deciliter, but we would often see drops of 100 milligrams per deciliter in a week, which is really quite extraordinary. And they would, one of the biggest comments we would get was, my head is clear. I have had a foggy head for 20 years, and all of a sudden I can think clearly again. The pain in their joints. And the other thing is their diet, they would average probably 7 to 10 grams of fiber a day. And we had people in our first cohort who hadn't been to the bathroom in 2 weeks. So, and going once a week was actually quite typical. It wasn't unusual at all. And so one of the biggest questions that I would receive is, I'm going to the bathroom every day. Am I okay? Because they couldn't imagine being able, it felt good, but they thought maybe there was something wrong with them.
Yeah.
Wow. So this is quite a huge transformation in what they were eating. So let me tell you how their lifestyles changed.
Please do.
So when we first arrived, it cost 25 cents for a taxi, because, taxi rides were usually just $2 or $3 or 2 or 3 blocks. It was usually downtown, and nobody walked anywhere. Because if you walked, it was proof positive that you were too poor for the 25 cents for the taxi.
So it's a status thing.
So it was a status thing. And so when we went in, it was fighting an uphill battle of trying to get people to recognize the value of physical activity and of healthy food. But the diet consists of largely ultra-processed foods, and white rice. And so breakfast was often donuts and a cup of coffee. For adults. For kids, it might be whatever fills your belly. So when you've lived off the land for so many generations, whatever fills your belly is going to be the kind of food you need. It'll be nutritious and it will sustain you. And they carried that forward, thinking, just if you fill your belly with enough food, you'll be good. And so I remember seeing children at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning with popsicle in one hand and a Pepsi in the other. And that would be breakfast. And so the idea, nutrition really wasn't well understood at all. And lunch was always white rice and meat, usually grilled chicken or some other meat. And dinner was the same. And it was washed down with this drink called luau. And luau, the first ingredient is high fructose corn syrup. And then it's high fructose corn syrup, flavors, colors, preservatives, and that's it. And so it's all washed down with that. And the kids' favorite snack is ramen noodles, you know, those deep fried, salty noodles in the little packs. They would crack those open and eat them raw. But before they would eat them, they would sprinkle a package of Kool-Aid powder on top. And if that isn't enough, I remember seeing a kid had just put their Kool-Aid on top and then cracked open this white package or this package of white powder and poured the white powder on. And I said to the Marshallese person that was next to me, well, what in the heck are they putting on their ramen noodles? And he said, oh, that's Ajinomoto. Well, Ajinomoto is pure MSG. So ramen noodles, Kool-Aid powder, and MSG, and that's one of the favorite snacks for the kids. So, you know, it honestly would be hard to design a diet to induce diabetes more effectively than the diet that's been adopted. And the other thing I should say is canned meats are very popular because they're fairly non-perishable. Spam and other, you know, black label luncheon meats are really popular. And the thing that really saddened me when I went into the grocery store was not only the price of the produce, but when I went to look at the price of the meat and the meat that was available, you would see packages of meat that were large, like a lot of meat. And usually it's the parts of the animals nobody else wants to eat, and they get shipped to these poorer countries, or just very cheap cuts of meat. But you could buy a pack of meat that big that would feed a very large family for $6.
Huh.
So, you know, what are you going to choose? The $7.99 avocado that's going bad, or this huge package of meat that'll feed your whole family?
Right.
You know?
Right.
So it's a very, very challenging situation.
I mean, it seems like you guys are facing a lot of obstacles, and it makes me wonder, like, how in the world were you able to put together a whole food plant-based menu for the people who were in this study? And I mean, it's one thing to use, you know, study funding to be able to bring in the produce that you need to for these people, but it's another thing when they're like given instructions and begin to cook on their own to expect them to do that. How did you guide them to navigate those challenges?
Well, our big emphasis was on choosing the less expensive produce that was, you know, more shelf stable, like cabbage and carrots and onions and things like that, making stews, using a lot of beans and whole grains. But we also put a huge amount of effort into growing food and teaching people. We brought in gardeners, we brought in soil experts, we brought in hundreds of earth boxes to give to people so they could grow food in their earth box. And the thing is that the sunshine is year-round, it's always warm, foods grow very quickly. We turned every crack and crevice of the hospital into gardens. And so all of these little spots between buildings all became gardens, and we did vertical gardens, and we just tried a lot of different things to produce food. We also had a wonderful relationship at that time when we were doing the research with the Taiwanese farms, and they have a Taiwanese farm at the north end of the island. And they were very generous with the produce that they would give us for the program. So they would grow beautiful spinach and tomatoes and little cherry tomatoes and eggplants and peppers, and they would give them to us for our program, which was really wonderful.
What joy it must be to work on that farm while you're living in an area like that where otherwise you wouldn't have access to that type of food.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So I have to tell you about some of the exciting changes that we saw. So one of the things that really changed when we did the research and got involved with the community, we spoke in all the churches, we went to all the schools. As a matter of fact, in 2017, I had the opportunity, I was invited to go and create a nutrition education program for the schools. And so did that in 2017. So we got involved in many layers of the community. And I also have to tell you, that in spite of this being a very poor and very challenging kind of environment for people, it is probably the most joyful place I've ever been.
Really?
People, they laugh and sing. And if you walk down the street and somebody's singing, the person beside them will start singing too. Nobody will look at you funny. It was just this complete acceptance of people in all sorts of walks of life, even people that would be walking down the street naked. They would be embraced by they wouldn't be looked upon in a funny way, or, if they had a mental health disorder. People were so kind, and they were just so joyful. Their laughter was so contagious. They had this deep laughter, and they poke fun at each other, but in the sweetest ways.
Yeah.
I just love them. I absolutely love them. And they're just their spirit. They have this beautiful, beautiful spirit, and they're so generous. When we were there, they would always, whenever you'd leave, even if you were only leaving for a week, they would give you a yuckway party and sing and play their little instruments and give you little gifts of, handmade things that with the bandana sleeves or whatever. It was just beautiful. And so it's really quite a culture, and it just tears my heart out to think of what's happening to these people. And I think about the impacts of climate change, because there's just no elevation. It's just the slightest elevation, and they probably will be the first casualty of climate change. They'll be under. I don't know the predictions. You see 50 to 100 years, but that's not a long time. So it's really, really scary. But yeah, so, going in and doing this program, some of the changes we saw was some of the restaurants started offering wellness center approved, items on their menus. Yeah, and 2 of the stores started having little healthy food sections where they would bring in special healthy peanut butter that doesn't have additives, and quinoa, and different things that people might have been looking for, so unsweetened soy milk and these kinds of foods. And then the other thing that happened is people started to look at exercise differently. And we had walkathons that hundreds of people started to take part in, and we started dance classes, and people loved the dance classes. And so we would do those for whoever was interested. I mean, it was part of our program, but afterwards we continued to offer these kinds of programs for the community. And then after the research was finished, we were able to maintain the wellness center there. They actually turned the wellness center into a wellness restaurant / intervention center, so that we could still have money coming in to pay the workers there. And so now for people that want to have a healthy meal at a reasonable cost, they can go still to the wellness center for that as well.
That's tremendous. Do you think that the fact that they are just by and large a happy society kind of like bode well for the outcomes of the research there? Like they were ready and happy to embrace these healthy changes.
Yeah. And so, to be honest with you, their food is so ingrained into their culture now, and they have a lot of, we talk about the blue zones, and one of the key aspects of the blue zones is the interconnectedness of these cultures. And the Marshall Islands, to me, is a world champion in that regard. But part of that for them is you see, a first birthday party, they'll have bins of meat, of processed meat, just huge bins, bin after bin after bin, and then a big bin of white rice. And it's hard for them to do it otherwise because produce is so expensive. And so it's been a real challenge to get change. We succeeded in getting sort of, if you will, the richer of the people in the population to shift a little bit. But for the poor people, it's really hard. And so for me, one of the biggest challenges is to get them eating beans. Beans are cheaper than meat. They're even cheaper than meat. If we could bring them in big bags and have people eat them like South Americans do or people from India do, that I think could be really transformational. Even if they continue to eat the white rice, if what's on top of that rice is beans, it will make a huge difference in the glycemic impact of that rice and that meal. And, and adding a few vegetables, some cabbage, some local, whatever they're growing, then that could work for them. And, it's interesting, when we went into the schools to do the education for the teachers, we always prepared a bean dish. And one of my favorite memories of that was this lady eating her little container of these beans and saying it was her first time eating beans in her life. She said, wow, she said, these beans taste as good as ice cream. And I thought, now that may be the best thing I've ever heard about the first time. Because, this is a culture where they really treasure their ice cream. Amazing.
And so let's do a quick nutrition refresher here. We talked a lot about the Marshall Islands, but let's talk about beans in general. Like, a lot of people who have come on this show, Brenda, have said that beans are probably like one of, if not the top most important food that a person can include in their diet.
Yeah. And if you look again at the blue zones, so the blue zones are these 5 areas of the world where there are more centenarians than anywhere else on the planet. And they live, not only do they live a long time, but when they reach these advanced ages, they're still really healthy. And there are certain things, that we can weave through all of the blue zones that are common to all blue zones. And where diet is concerned, there are 2 features. One is they all consume a plant-based diet. And the second is they all include legumes as a dietary staple. And there are 2 studies that, just to highlight these studies, one came out fairly recently, 2023. I think it had 32 meta-analyses or something included. They found for every 1/4 cup serving of legumes, you reduce risk of mortality 6%. Now, there was another study, this is an older study, 2004, but they looked at only people over the age of 70, and they found for every 2 tablespoons of legumes consumed, they reduced mortality 7 to 8%.
That's not a lot.
And no, 2 tablespoons. So if you did the math, if you ate an entire cup of beans based on that data, you would reduce mortality 60 to 68%.
Wow.
And so legumes are such a valuable food because they're inexpensive. They sit on a shelf pretty well. They're fairly non-perishable when they're dried.
Yeah.
They're easy to cook. They're delicious. You can do so many things with them. But they're also the most concentrated source of dietary fiber. So you get about 10 to 20 grams of fiber in a cup of legumes. Most other foods, like most grains, are around 5 to 8 per cup. Berries are in that range as well. And then other fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds will be, around 2 to 5 per cup or per serving. And so beans really are the most concentrated source of dietary fiber we have, but they're also rich in plant sterols and stanols, and they're rich in all sorts of, prebiotics, which of course is tied to fiber, but also things like antioxidants and phytochemicals. And these are really valuable plant foods.
Score 1 for beans.
Yeah.
But I know that we'll end with this. You took some lentils down there with you too, and all the way up to the president's dining room table.
Yes. So when my son and I went back a few weeks ago, we had 2 big challenges. And one was to retrain the wellness center staff, because the foods they were offering were starting to slip. So they had, somehow under the door gotten some deep fried foods into the menus.
Uh-oh.
And so I created some very, firm guidelines about what we would serve in the wellness center. And we were trying to help them revamp the menus and come up with items that would be, these deep fried items became the most popular items on the menu, which was pretty heartbreaking for me.
Sure.
So we were there to do that, but we were also there to provide wonderful education for the president and her ministers, and for the Attorney General and his staff, for the Auditor General and his staff, but to try to make an impact at the higher levels of government. And so we had this opportunity to prepare food for the president and to provide a sort of a gala, plant-based gala evening. And we, my son, because we couldn't get tofu, my son came up with this idea of preparing these lentil cutlets. And it's basically lentils blended in a blender. Cook them. You don't have to add anything except seasoning. You want it to have some flavor. Cook it till it gets quite thick, and then you pat it down quickly. You have to do it quite fast or it solidifies into, loaf pans, refrigerate it, and then you slice it. And then you can prepare these cutlets and serve them with mushroom gravy. And that was one of the main dishes that we provided for the evening with the president. And they loved them. So that was pretty fun.
Rumor has it the president didn't even realize it was lentils initially, correct?
Yeah. I think they were thinking it was some kind of meat. And we're quite surprised that it was lentils.
Yeah. All right. Well, we look forward to seeing the study published, and that way we can dive a little bit deeper into the data. I'd love to crunch numbers with you, but I just don't think that would be appropriate without the results hitting the journal quite yet. But it's always a thrill when you're on the show, Brenda. Thank you so much for being here today. And congrats on all the work in the Marshall Islands. Amazing.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the amazing work you're doing. I'm so excited to see how this podcast has grown and become like the biggest ever. So we're very proud of you and all that you've done and all that you've accomplished.
Thank you. The champion of the podcast. And by the way, there's a link to all of Brenda's books that you can pick up right now in the show description and in the episode notes. Brenda Davis, thank you.
Thank you so much.